The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of the royal palace, where hundreds of onlookers had gathered for what would become the most talked-about encounter in the kingdom's recent history. Among the crowd stood Marcus Rivera, a 28-year-old Marine who had returned home just 3 weeks earlier after serving 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his civilian clothes, still uncomfortable in anything other than his uniform. Marcus had come to the palace not for spectacle, but for closure. His younger brother David had been a royal guard, one of the elite protectors who stood watch over the monarchy with unwavering loyalty. David had died 6 months ago during a training accident that the official reports claimed was unavoidable, but Marcus knew better. He had received letters from David expressing concerns about inadequate safety protocols, outdated equipment, and a commanding officer who prioritized appearance over the welfare of his men. The Marine had requested an audience with the Royal Guard's leadership multiple times through proper channels, only to be dismissed with form letters and bureaucratic delays. Today, he had come to make his case directly, carrying a folder of David's letters and photographs that told a different story than the sanitized version presented to the public. As Marcus stood in the designated area for visitors, his eyes fixed on the royal guards positioned around the courtyard. They stood at perfect attention in their ceremonial uniforms, rifles at their sides, faces hidden behind the traditional bearskin hats that had become synonymous with royal protection. Each guard represented years of training, discipline, and dedication to a code that supposedly valued honor above all else. One guard in particular caught Marcus's attention. The man stood directly across from him, perhaps 30 feet away, positioned near the main entrance to the palace. Something about his posture, the slight tension in his shoulders, suggested he was different from the others. This was Captain James Wellington, a 15-year veteran of the Royal Guard who had been David's direct superior and the officer responsible for the training exercise that had claimed the young man's life. Wellington had seen Marcus approaching earlier and immediately recognized him from the photographs in David's personal file. The family resemblance was unmistakable, the same determined jawline, the same piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through pretense and ceremony to the truth underneath. The captain had been dreading this moment for months, knowing that eventually David's family would come seeking answers he wasn't authorized to provide. The crowd around them continued to grow as tourists and locals gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony, a daily ritual that drew visitors from around the world. Children pointed excitedly at the imposing figures in their traditional uniforms, while parents snapped photographs and guidebooks explained the historical significance of each element of the pageantry. But Marcus saw none of the ceremony's majesty. Instead, he saw a system that had failed his brother, that had prioritized tradition and appearance over the safety of the young men sworn to uphold it. His military training had taught him to respect chain of command, to follow protocol, to trust in the system. But his experience in combat zones had also taught him that sometimes the system failed, and when it did, good people died unnecessarily. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus found himself locked in an unspoken exchange with Captain Wellington. Neither man moved from his position, neither acknowledged the other's presence overtly, yet both were acutely aware of the weight of the moment. The captain's training demanded he maintain his post and his composure, while his conscience wrestled with the knowledge of what had really happened during that fatal training exercise. Wellington remembered David Rivera as one of the most promising young guards he had ever commanded. The 22-year-old had possessed a rare combination of physical capability and genuine concern for others that marked him as future leadership material. David had questioned the safety protocols not out of insubordination, but from a genuine desire to protect his fellow guards. He had approached Wellington privately multiple times, expressing concerns about equipment that hadn't been properly maintained and training scenarios that pushed men beyond reasonable safety limits. The captain had listened to these concerns and had even agreed with many of them privately. But he had also been under intense pressure from his superiors to maintain the traditional training methods that had been used for generations. Budget constraints meant that equipment updates were often delayed, and the ceremonial nature of much of their duties left little room for the kind of practical safety modifications that David had suggested. On the day of the accident, Wellington had been conducting a training exercise designed to test the guards' ability to respond to multiple threats while maintaining their ceremonial positions. The scenario involved navigating an obstacle course while carrying full ceremonial gear, including the heavy rifles and cumbersome hats that were part of their daily uniform. David had been paired with another young guard for a timed exercise that required them to move through the course while maintaining communication and coordination. The equipment failure that killed David had been predicted in his letters to Marcus. A safety harness that should have been replaced months earlier had given way during a rappelling exercise, sending the young guard falling 30 feet onto concrete. The official investigation had concluded that the accident was unforeseeable, the result of a perfect storm of circumstances that no amount of preparation could have prevented. But Wellington knew the truth was far more complicated. The harness had shown signs of wear that any thorough inspection would have caught. The exercise itself had been designed more for spectacle than practical application, pushed forward despite concerns raised by multiple guards. Most damning of all, the safety protocols that might have prevented the accident had been relaxed to meet an arbitrary timeline set by officials more concerned with ceremony than with the lives of the men carrying it out. As Marcus stood in the courtyard, he could see some of this knowledge reflected in Wellington's carefully controlled expression. The Marines' training had taught him to read people, to spot the signs of guilt and responsibility that men tried to hide. He could see the weight of command in the captain's shoulders, the burden of decisions that had consequences measured in human lives rather than mere protocol violations. The crowd around them continued to ebb and flow, tourists taking photographs and children asking their parents questions about the colorful uniforms and impressive weapons. But for Marcus and Wellington, the world had narrowed to this single moment of recognition and unspoken communication. The Marines' presence was a challenge that couldn't be ignored, a demand for accountability that transcended the normal boundaries of rank and position. Marcus had spent weeks preparing for this confrontation, studying the protocols and procedures that governed how civilians could seek redress for military actions. He had consulted with veterans advocates, spoken with lawyers, and exhausted every official channel available to him. But he had also learned that sometimes the most powerful communication happened without words, that the simple act of bearing witness could be more effective than any formal complaint or legal proceeding. The folder in Marcus's hands contained more than just evidence of negligence. It held David's dreams for the future, his plans for a career in service to his country, his hopes for eventually starting a family and building a life that honored the values they had both been raised to embrace. These letters revealed a young man who had been excited about his role as a royal guard, proud to be part of an institution with such a storied history, but increasingly concerned about practices that put that history above the welfare of the people sworn to uphold it. Wellington could almost feel the weight of those documents from across the courtyard. He had read David's official file multiple times since the accident, had memorized every commendation and evaluation that painted a picture of a promising young soldier cut down in his prime. But he suspected that Marcus's folder contained a more complete picture, one that included the concerns and criticisms that had never made it into the official record. The captain found himself thinking about his own son, a boy just 2 years younger than David had been when he died. Wellington had been so proud when the young man had expressed interest in following in his father's footsteps, had even begun the preliminary steps toward applying for the Royal Guard training program. But now, faced with the consequences of his own decisions and the reality of what that service truly entailed, he found himself questioning whether he could in good conscience encourage his son to pursue the same path. As the morning progressed, other guards began to notice the tension between their captain and the civilian who seemed to be studying them with uncommon intensity. The younger guards recognized the bearing and posture that marked Marcus as former military, while the more experienced ones picked up on the emotional undercurrent that seemed to flow between the two primary figures in this unfolding drama. The crowd continued to grow, drawn by the approaching time for the changing of the guard ceremony, but also by the palpable tension that seemed to emanate from the silent confrontation taking place in their midst. Some visitors began to sense that they were witnessing something more significant than the usual tourist attraction, though few could articulate exactly what was happening. Marcus felt the weight of his brother's memory pressing down on him like a physical force. David had been more than just a sibling. He had been a friend, a confidant, and in many ways a moral compass for the entire family. The younger man's death had shattered something fundamental in Marcus's understanding of how the world worked, how institutions were supposed to protect the people who served them faithfully. The Marines' own military experience had included its share of loss and tragedy, but those deaths had occurred in combat zones where danger was understood and accepted as part of the mission. David's death felt different, preventable, the result of negligence and institutional indifference rather than the hazards of honorable service. This distinction made the loss infinitely more painful and the need for accountability infinitely more urgent. Wellington found himself remembering the conversation he had had with David just days before the fatal accident. The young guard had approached him once again about the safety concerns, this time with specific recommendations for equipment upgrades and protocol modifications that could significantly reduce the risk of training accidents. The captain had promised to forward these suggestions up the chain of command, knowing even as he made the promise that budget constraints and institutional inertia would likely prevent any meaningful action. Now, standing under the weight of Marcus's silent accusation, Wellington realized that his failure hadn't been in the details of that particular training exercise, but in his failure to fight more aggressively for the changes that David and others had identified as necessary. He had allowed himself to become complicit in a system that prioritized appearance and tradition over the fundamental duty to protect the men under his command. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than an hour, and Wellington knew that he would be expected to participate with the same precise movements and unwavering composure that had characterized his 15 years of service. But he also knew that this ceremony would be different, conducted under the watchful eye of a man whose presence challenged everything the pageantry was supposed to represent. The palace bells chimed 11 o'clock, signaling that the changing of the guard ceremony would commence in 30 minutes. The crowd had swelled to nearly 300 people, a mixture of tourists clutching cameras, local residents who had made watching the ceremony part of their daily routine, and a growing number of observers who seemed to sense that something unusual was unfolding before their eyes. Marcus had not moved from his position, his feet planted firmly on the ancient cobblestones as if he were anchored there by the weight of his brother's memory. The folder containing David's letters remained clutched in his left hand, while his right hand hung loosely at his side, fingers occasionally flexing in a gesture that anyone with military experience would recognize as the unconscious preparation for action that never quite left a soldier's muscle memory. Captain Wellington had likewise maintained his post, though the strain of the prolonged silent confrontation was beginning to show in the subtle tremor that occasionally ran through his ceremonial sword hand. His fellow officers had begun to take notice of the unusual situation, exchanging brief glances and subtle hand signals that indicated their awareness that something was amiss with their commanding officer. The tourists around them continued their normal activities, taking photographs and asking questions of the uniformed guards who were authorized to interact with the public. But even the casual observers were beginning to pick up on the tension that seemed to crackle in the air between the Marine and the captain. Some pointed discreetly in their direction, whispering to their companions about the intensity of the stare-down that was taking place amid the pageantry and ceremony. Among the crowd, An elderly woman named Eleanor Hartwell stood with her granddaughter, both of whom had come to London from Scotland specifically to see the Royal Guards. Eleanor had been a nurse during World War II and had developed an ability to read the emotional undercurrents that men tried to hide behind military bearing. She could see the pain in Marcus's eyes and the guilt that Wellington was struggling to contain, and she found herself more interested in their silent drama than in the official ceremony that was about to unfold. "Gran, why is that man staring at the guard like that?" asked 12-year-old Sophie, her voice carrying the innocent curiosity that children bring to adult situations they don't fully understand. Eleanor studied the scene more carefully, taking in Marcus's bearing, the way he held himself with the disciplined posture of a professional soldier, and the deep sadness that seemed to radiate from him despite his outward composure. "Sometimes, dear," she said softly, "people have conversations that don't require words. I think that man has something very important to say to that guard, and they're having that conversation right now." Meanwhile, other members of the Royal Guard had begun to take more active notice of the situation. Sergeant Major Patrick O'Brien, a 20-year veteran who served as Wellington's second-in-command, moved with practiced discretion to a position where he could better observe both his captain and the civilian who seemed to be the focus of such intense attention. O'Brien had known David Rivera well, and had been present during the accident that claimed the young man's life. Unlike Wellington, he had not been directly responsible for the training exercise, but he carried his own burden of guilt for not speaking up more forcefully about the safety concerns that several guards had raised. O'Brien could see the recognition in Wellington's eyes, could read the complex mix of emotions that his commanding officer was struggling to control. The sergeant major had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles and had learned to spot the signs of a man carrying the weight of decisions that had cost lives. He had seen that same look in Wellington's eyes every day since David's death, had watched his respected leader struggle with the knowledge of what his choices had cost. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony time approached, and Marcus found himself surrounded by excited tourists and chattering families, all eager to witness the spectacle of the changing of the guard. But the Marine felt increasingly isolated, as if he and Wellington existed in a bubble separate from the celebration around them. The contrast between the joy and excitement of the tourists and the gravity of his own mission created a surreal atmosphere that made the entire situation feel like something from a dream. A group of American tourists positioned themselves directly beside Marcus, their enthusiasm for the upcoming ceremony providing an almost jarring counterpoint to the emotional intensity of his confrontation with Wellington. The tour guide, a cheerful woman in her 40s named Patricia Mills, began explaining the historical significance of the ceremony to her charges, her practiced narration delivering facts and anecdotes that she had repeated hundreds of times before. "The Royal Guard has protected the British monarchy for over 300 years, Patricia explained, gesturing toward the imposing figures in their red tunics and bearskin hats. Each guard undergoes years of rigorous training and must meet the highest standards of discipline and dedication. They are among the finest soldiers in the world, chosen not only for their military skills, but for their unwavering commitment to duty and honor." Marcus listened to these words with a mixture of irony and pain. David had certainly possessed that unwavering commitment to duty and honor, had embodied the very qualities that Patricia was describing to her enthusiastic audience. But that commitment had not been enough to protect him from a system that had failed to live up to its own stated values, that had allowed ceremony and tradition to take precedence over the fundamental obligation to protect the men who served. Wellington, too, could hear the tour guide's words, and each syllable felt like an accusation. He had dedicated his entire adult life to the ideals she was describing, had shaped his identity around the concept of honor and duty that supposedly defined the Royal Guard. But David's death had forced him to confront the gap between those ideals and the reality of an institution that sometimes prioritized appearance over substance, tradition over the welfare of the people who upheld it. As the minutes ticked toward the official start of the ceremony, Wellington found himself thinking about the conversation he would eventually have to have with Marcus. He knew that the Marine's presence was not going to disappear with the completion of the changing of the guard, that this silent confrontation was building toward something more direct and potentially more damaging to the carefully maintained image of the Royal Guard. The captain had been briefed by his superiors about the potential for family members to seek answers about David's death, had been coached on the appropriate responses that would protect both the institution and the individuals involved in the training accident. But standing under Marcus's unwavering gaze, those carefully prepared responses seemed inadequate and even insulting to the memory of the young man who had died under his command. Among the crowd, a local journalist named Michael Thompson had begun to take notice of the unusual dynamic between the Marine and the captain. Thompson wrote for a London newspaper and had covered the Royal Guard for several years, attending dozens of changing of the Guard ceremonies and developing an eye for the subtle variations that marked each day's performance. But he had never seen anything quite like the tension that was currently playing out before his eyes. Thompson began to discreetly photograph the scene, capturing the intensity of Marcus's expression and the barely controlled emotion in Wellington's bearing. His journalistic instincts told him that there was a story here, something more significant than the usual tourist attraction that the ceremony represented. He made mental notes about the timing and the participants, already beginning to plan the inquiries he would need to make to understand what was really happening. The Marine's thoughts turned to the conversation he had had with David during their last phone call, just 2 weeks before the accident. His brother had sounded troubled, had spoken vaguely about problems at work that he couldn't discuss in detail over an unsecured line. David had asked about Marcus's experiences in Afghanistan, specifically about how to handle situations where following orders might conflict with protecting the people under your command. At the time, Marcus had assumed that David was dealing with typical military bureaucracy, the kind of institutional friction that every soldier encountered at some point in their career. He had offered general advice about working within the system, about finding ways to advocate for change without damaging your own career prospects. Now, knowing what had happened, Marcus realized that his brother had been reaching out for help with a situation that would ultimately cost him his life. Wellington remembered that same time period, recalled the increasing frequency with which David had approached him with safety concerns and suggestions for improving training protocols. The young guard had been respectful and professional in his approach, had framed his concerns in terms of unit effectiveness rather than as criticism of existing procedures. But the captain had been under pressure from his own superiors to maintain training schedules and to avoid any modifications that might require additional funding or equipment upgrades. The irony was not lost on Wellington that David's death had ultimately resulted in exactly the kind of review and reform that the young man had been advocating for while he was alive. In the months following the accident, safety protocols had been extensively revised, equipment had been upgraded, and training procedures had been modified to reduce the risk of similar incidents. But these changes had come too late for David, had been purchased with the life of the very person who had been trying to prevent the need for them. As the ceremony approached, the guards began their final preparations, checking equipment and reviewing the precise movements that would shortly be performed for the entertainment and education of the assembled crowd. But the usual sense of pride and anticipation that accompanied these preparations was overshadowed by the emotional weight of the confrontation that continued to unfold between their commanding officer and the grieving brother who had come seeking answers. Marcus could see the younger guards stealing glances in his direction, could read the curiosity and concern in their expressions as they tried to understand what was happening. Some of these men were probably close to David's age, were facing the same kinds of challenges and pressures that had ultimately contributed to his brother's death. The Marine found himself wondering whether any of them had their own concerns about safety and protocol, whether they were struggling with the same conflicts between duty and self-preservation that had troubled David. The crowd continued to grow, pressing closer to the barriers that separated the tourists from the guards, cameras and phones at the ready to capture the spectacle that was about to unfold. The excitement was palpable, the kind of anticipation that builds when people know they are about to witness something special, something that they will remember and talk about for years to come. But for Marcus and Wellington, the approaching ceremony felt more like a deadline than a celebration, a moment when the carefully maintained facade of military precision and honor would be tested against the reality of loss and accountability that hung between them like a sword waiting to fall. Neither man knew exactly what would happen when the formal ceremony concluded, but both understood that their silent confrontation was building toward a resolution that would change everything. The first notes of the military band signaled the beginning of the changing of the guard ceremony, and the crowd fell into an expectant hush that seemed to amplify the emotional tension that had been building between Marcus and Captain Wellington for the past hour. The Marine stood perfectly still as the pageantry unfolded around him, his eyes never leaving Wellington's face as the captain prepared to participate in a ritual that suddenly felt like a mockery of everything his brother had believed in. The guards began their precisely choreographed movements, each step and gesture perfected through countless hours of practice and refined over generations of tradition. The tourists raised their cameras and phones, capturing images of the colorful spectacle that would serve as souvenirs of their visit to London. But Marcus saw only the contrast between the perfect synchronization of the ceremony and the chaos of the training accident that had claimed David's life. Wellington moved with the same mechanical precision that had characterized his 15 years of service, but every motion felt weighted with the knowledge of what it truly cost to maintain this level of discipline and perfection. He could feel Marcus's eyes tracking his every movement, could sense the judgment and demand for accountability that radiated from the Marine's unwavering stare. The captain's normally automatic responses felt forced and artificial, as if he were performing for an audience that could see through the ceremony to the truth underneath. As the ceremony reached its midpoint, something unexpected happened. A young girl in the crowd, perhaps 8 years old, dropped her toy soldier near the barrier that separated the tourists from the guards. The small figure bounced across the cobblestones and came to rest directly between Marcus and Wellington, creating a symbolic bridge between the two men who had been locked in their silent confrontation. The child's father moved to retrieve the toy, but Marcus stepped forward first, bending down to pick up the small soldier with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the intensity of his previous bearing. For a moment, the Marine's expression softened as he examined the miniature figure, seeing in it an echo of his brother's childhood dreams of military service, of the ideals and aspirations that had led David to join the Royal Guard in the first place. Wellington watched this interaction with growing emotion, seeing in Marcus's careful handling of the toy soldier a reflection of the love and protection that the Marine had felt for his younger brother. The captain realized that the man standing across from him was not just seeking accountability for David's death, but was trying to honor the memory of someone who had embodied the very best of what military service was supposed to represent. Marcus returned the toy to the grateful child, but instead of returning to his previous position, he took several steps closer to Wellington, closing the distance between them until only 15 feet separated the two men. The crowd around them seemed to sense that something significant was happening, and a circle of space began to form around the Marine and the captain as other observers unconsciously moved back to give them room. Wellington felt his heart rate increase as Marcus approached, but he maintained his ceremonial posture and continued to participate in the changing of the guard as if nothing unusual was happening. The captain's training demanded that he complete his duties regardless of personal distractions. But he could feel the weight of the moment building toward something that would require him to choose between his obligations as a soldier and his responsibilities as a human being. The Marine reached into his jacket and withdrew the folder containing David's letters, holding it out toward Wellington in a gesture that was both an offering and an accusation. The documents represented evidence of the concerns and warnings that had gone unheeded, but they also contained David's hopes and dreams, his vision for what the Royal Guard could become if it lived up to its stated ideals. For several seconds, Wellington stared at the folder without moving, understanding that accepting it would represent an acknowledgement of responsibility that could have far-reaching consequences for his career and for the institution he had served faithfully for 15 years. But he also understood that refusing it would be a betrayal of David's memory and of the principles that were supposed to guide the Royal Guard. The crowd had fallen almost completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that transcended the normal boundaries of ceremony and protocol. Even the guards participating in the changing of the guard seemed affected by the gravity of the moment, their movements becoming more solemn and deliberate as they continued their prescribed duties. Eleanor Hartwell, the elderly nurse who had been watching the confrontation with her granddaughter, found tears forming in her eyes as she recognized the profound emotion that was playing out before them. She had seen enough loss and grief during her nursing career to understand the depth of Marcus's pain and the complexity of Wellington's position. Her granddaughter Sophie stood quietly beside her, instinctively understanding that something important was happening even if she couldn't fully comprehend its significance. Michael Thompson, the journalist who had been documenting the scene, realized that he was witnessing a moment that would define how the public understood the relationship between military institutions and the individuals who served them. He continued to take photographs, but with a growing sense of responsibility to capture not just the spectacle of the confrontation, but the human dignity and pain that both men displayed in their different ways. Wellington finally reached out and took the folder from Marcus's hands, their fingers briefly touching in a moment of human connection that seemed to bridge the gap between their different roles and responsibilities. The captain's acceptance of the documents felt like a promise, an acknowledgement that David's concerns had been valid and that his death had not been in vain. As Wellington opened the folder and began to read David's handwriting, his carefully maintained composure finally began to crack. The young guard's words were respectful but urgent, outlining specific safety concerns and offering detailed suggestions for improvements that could prevent exactly the kind of accident that had ultimately claimed his life. The letters revealed not a troublemaker or malcontent, but a dedicated soldier who had cared deeply about the welfare of his fellow guards. Marcus watched Wellington's reaction with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, seeing in the captain's expression the recognition and remorse that he had been seeking. But the Marine also felt a profound sadness as he realized that this moment, as necessary as it was, could not bring David back or undo the institutional failures that had contributed to his death. The ceremony continued around them, but both men had become completely absorbed in their personal confrontation with the consequences of David's death. Wellington read each letter carefully, his military bearing gradually giving way to the posture of a man confronting the weight of his own failures and the cost of his decisions. When the captain finished reading, he looked up to meet Marcus's eyes directly for the first time since the confrontation had begun. In that moment, all pretense fell away, and the two men saw each other not as Marine and Royal Guard, not as civilian and officer, but as human beings who had both been changed by David's death in profound and permanent ways. "He was a good soldier," Wellington said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the ceremony, but carrying clearly to Marcus in the bubble of silence that seemed to surround them. "He deserved better from all of us." Marcus felt a surge of emotion at hearing his brother's military service acknowledged and validated by the man whose decisions had contributed to his death. The Marine had not come seeking an apology or even an admission of guilt, but rather recognition that David's concerns had been legitimate and that his death represented a failure of the system rather than an unavoidable tragedy. "He believed in what you do here," Marcus replied, his voice steady, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He just wanted it to be worthy of that belief. The crowd around them had grown completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than they had expected when they came to see the changing of the guard. Many of the tourists had lowered their cameras, instinctively understanding that what was happening deserved their attention and respect rather than their documentation. Wellington carefully closed the folder and held it against his chest, understanding that he now carried the responsibility for ensuring that David's concerns were addressed and that similar tragedies were prevented in the future. The captain realized that his duty extended beyond following orders and maintaining traditions to include protecting the men under his command, even when that protection required challenging the very system he had sworn to serve. As the ceremony reached its conclusion, both men remained in their positions, but the nature of their confrontation had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a demand for accountability had evolved into a shared commitment to honoring David's memory through meaningful change and reform. Marcus had found the recognition he had been seeking, while Wellington had discovered a path toward redemption that would require him to become the kind of leader that David had believed he could be. The crowd began to disperse as the ceremony officially ended, but many observers remained, sensing that the real conclusion to what they had witnessed was still to come. The changing of the guard had become a backdrop to a more profound transformation, one that would ripple outward from this moment to affect not just Marcus and Wellington, but everyone who understood that true honor required more than ceremony and tradition. In the days that followed, Wellington would use David's letters to initiate comprehensive reforms to training protocols and safety procedures, changes that would save other young soldiers from the fate that had claimed David Rivera. Marcus would return home with the knowledge that his brother's death had not been forgotten, and that his concerns had finally found a voice within the very institution that had failed him. The wordless duel had ended not with victory or defeat, but with understanding and a shared commitment to ensuring that David's sacrifice would lead to the kind of change he had died trying to achieve. In the end, the most powerful communication had indeed required no words at all, only the courage to face truth and the wisdom to transform pain into purpose.